Did you know that some of the smartest people in history, like Isaac Newton and Warren Buffett, made financial decisions that were so bad they lost millions? And it's not because they were stupid, but because of a psychological phenomenon that affects us all? Making smart financial decisions is crucial for achieving our goals and living a life of freedom, but despite our best intentions, many of us make dumb decisions when it comes to money. And it's not just about being impulsive or reckless. It's about understanding the psychology behind our choices, and that's what we're going to explore in this video. So if you're curious about why smart people make dumb decisions, and how you can avoid making the same mistakes, then keep watching because this is going to be a game changer, and by the end of this video, you'll have a new perspective on money and how to make better decisions. So let's dive in and explore the psychology of money. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a psychological phenomenon where people who are incompetent in a particular domain tend to overestimate their own abilities and performance, and this can lead to poor financial decisions, as seen in a study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1999. For example, a study found that people who scored in the 12th percentile on a test of financial literacy believed they scored in the 62nd percentile, which means they thought they were above average. And this kind of overconfidence can lead to taking on too much risk and making poor investment decisions, just like the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s, where people invested in companies without doing their due diligence. So, the next time you're making a financial decision, take a step back and ask yourself if you're truly knowledgeable about the subject, and be honest with yourself, because recognizing your own limitations is the first step to making better decisions. Loss aversion is a psychological phenomenon where people prefer to avoid losses rather than acquire gains, and this can lead to holding on to investments that are losing value, as described by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their 1979 paper, Prospect Theory. For example, imagine you bought a stock for $100 and it's now worth $80. You might be reluctant to sell it because you don't want to realize the loss, but this kind of thinking can lead to holding on to a losing investment for too long, and missing out on other opportunities, just like the story of the investor who held on to Enron stock all the way to bankruptcy. So, the next time you're considering selling an investment, try to separate your emotions from the decision and focus on the facts, because sometimes it's better to cut your losses and move on. The endowment effect is a psychological phenomenon where people overvalue things they own, simply because they own them, as demonstrated in a study by Richard Thaler in 1980. For example, imagine you bought a watch for $500 and now it's worth $200. You might still think it's worth $500 because it's yours. And this kind of thinking can lead to overvaluing your possessions and making poor financial decisions, just like the person who refuses to sell their old car because they think it's still worth what they paid for it. So, the next time you're considering selling something, try to take a step back and evaluate its true value, because sometimes it's better to let go of something that's no longer serving you. Framing effects refer to the way in which information is presented, which can influence our decisions, as shown in a study by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in 1981. For example, imagine you're considering investing in a stock and the broker tells you it has a 70% chance of success. You might be more likely to invest than if they told you it has a 30% chance of failure, even though the two statements are equivalent, and this kind of framing can lead to making poor investment decisions, just like the story of the investor who was swayed by a broker's optimistic pitch. So, the next time you're presented with information, try to look beyond the way it's framed and focus on the underlying facts, because sometimes the way something is presented can be just as important as the information itself. The sunk cost fallacy is a psychological phenomenon where people continue to invest in something because of the resources they've already committed, even if it no longer makes sense to do so, as described by Robert Cialdini in his 1984 book Influence. For example, imagine you bought a timeshare and it's not working out. You might be tempted to continue paying for it because you've already sunk so much money into it, but this kind of thinking can lead to throwing good money after bad, just like the story of the investor who continued to pour money into a failing business because they didn't want to admit defeat. So, the next time you're considering continuing to invest in something, ask yourself if it still makes sense to do so, and be willing to cut your losses if it doesn't, because sometimes it's better to admit defeat and move on. Mental accounting refers to the way in which we treat different types of money differently, as described by Richard Thaler in his 1985 paper Mental Accounting and Consumer Choice. For example, imagine you received a tax refund of $1,000 and you think of it as free money. You might be more likely to spend it on something frivolous than if you had earned it through your job. And this kind of thinking can lead to making poor financial decisions, just like the person who blows their entire bonus on a luxury item. So, the next time you receive a windfall, try to treat it as if you had earned it through your job, because sometimes the way we think about money can be just as important as the amount we have. The status quo bias is a psychological phenomenon where people prefer to stick with the status quo, even if it's not in their best interests, as demonstrated in a study by Samuelson and Zeckhauser in 1988. For example, imagine you're considering switching to a new investment portfolio. You might be tempted to stick with your current one because it's familiar, even if it's not performing as well as the new one. And this kind of thinking can lead to missing out on better opportunities, just like the story of the investor who stuck with an underperforming mutual fund because they didn't want to rock the boat. So, the next time you're considering making a change, try to evaluate the options objectively and don't be afraid to switch if it's in your best interests, because sometimes the status quo is not the best option. In conclusion, making smart financial decisions requires more than just knowledge and skills. It requires an understanding of the psychological biases and heuristics that influence our choices. And by recognizing these biases and taking steps to overcome them, you can make better decisions and achieve your financial goals. So remember to be aware of the Dunning-Kruger effect, loss aversion, the endowment effect, framing effects, the sunk cost fallacy, mental accounting, and the status quo bias, and take a step back to evaluate your decisions objectively. Thanks for watching, and if you want to learn more about the psychology of money and how to make better financial decisions, be sure to subscribe to our channel and comment below with your favorite money psychology concept. And if you have a question about how to apply these concepts to your own life, leave it in the comments and we'll do our best to answer it in a future video.